Thanks for joining us today, Matt. Perhaps we could start with an overview of the NCFTA.
Okay, thanks, Andy. For folks on the webinar here, the NCFTA, I'll give you a little bit of background on the NCFTA. And the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance is a 501c3 company headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it was started back in 2002 as a fix, if you will, for government to industry communication exchange. So the challenge back in the day was government or law enforcement, when I say government, law enforcement needing to hear issues, threats, what's going on out in private industry, and private industry making the effort to provide information to law enforcement, and then wanting something in return. And unfortunately, the answer they typically got was, well, we can't tell you that, it's classified. And private industry, the frustration is, well, why did you classify that? We're the ones that gave it to you. And so there was this need for two-way information sharing. And the folks in Pittsburgh, private industry, academia, and law enforcement, came up with this idea of creating a neutral environment, the NCFTA, where cross-sector industry and law enforcement could have the option of co-locating as one option, or working together virtually on specific threats to industry and helping to bubble those threats up to make them actionable for law enforcement.
Thanks, Matt. Everyone understands what a data breach is, but not everyone understands what business email compromise is. What exactly is business email compromise?
So one of the things we work on here with private industry is hearing some of the major impacts, some of the impactful threats, fraud schemes that they're experiencing. What are the details around them, and how can we work to illuminate those threats in order for law enforcement to understand them and then take action on them? One of those initiatives that we have here is called business email compromise. And so what is business email compromise? Business email compromise is, the definition is a use of a compromised or spoofed business email account to convince someone to do something. For example, transfer funds from a business account. This would typically be a business executive, say a CFO, would receive an email that appeared to be from the CEO and saying, hey, Jim, if you're in the office today, I just signed a contract for a large company training event, and I need you to wire the money to this account. And when I get back into the office, I'll give you the invoice, and you can complete the books there. Unfortunately, that email did not come from the CEO, and the responsive CFO, thinking that that's who it came from, goes ahead and sends the wire to the beneficiary account, and next time the boss is in the office, he dutifully says, hey, I took care of that invoice, and the boss says, what invoice? And then they basically look at each other and say, uh-oh. We've seen this occur in a lot of different scenarios to the tune of millions of dollars at a time. And so it could be a business executive being impersonated. It could be a vendor being impersonated. So you could have a relationship, company could have a relationship with a foreign supplier, say, and you get an invoice that appears to be coming from your vendor. You get the invoice, it goes to process, and it gets paid. And it turns out the next time you talk to that vendor, they don't know what invoice you're talking about, and they never got paid. So that money went to a Hong Kong bank, and it's long gone. Another scheme could be an attorney is impersonated, contacts a business executive, and there's always a theme of exigent circumstances. So, hey, we need to close this deal, and I need you to send, the payment for that project we were working on, and they give payment instructions, and I need this done by the end of the day. and then it's completed all via email communication, and unfortunately it was a compromised or spoofed email, and the executive sent the money, and it didn't go where it was intended.
What are the impacts from business email compromise?
So the impacts from business email compromise are extensive. It's one of the top internet fraud complaints that the IC3 or the Internet Crime Complaint Center receives. They've gotten over the past, say, 2 or 3 years. They have seen similarities between complaints and have lumped them into this business email compromise category. But once they did that, they recognized that this is a significant impact on industry, to the tune of, up to $5.3 billion of losses. And these are not attempts; these are losses incurred by industry. And depending on who you talk to, for example, Trend Micro came out with a report projecting that in 2018 these types of attacks could exceed $9 billion.
And Matt, that's exactly right, because what it seems to be happening these days on the cyber front is we're seeing less and less of sort of that mega breach, if you will, and the cyber criminals seems to have shifted their tactics a little bit and focused more on this kind of activity, particularly after sort of the wave of ransomware we saw previously. And so this is a much more direct pipeline for them just to get money without sort of having to sell anything in the middle on the dark web or extort companies. And it's a real problem because these cyber criminals aren't going to sit idly by. And as long as this continues to be profitable, I think we'll continue to see this type of conduct.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It is a kind of a low-calorie burn type of effort. It's a form of social engineering. It's a form of phishing. And so they're combining that with some targeted spear phishing attacks. They do recognize, they do their homework, they do their recon, so it's similar to a data breach, similar to a large data breach. They're going to target a specific company, they're going to do their recon, they're going to do their intelligence gathering. So in business email compromise, they do the same thing, and they'll know exactly who to contact at a particular company. They'll know who's responsible for what. And you can say, well, how would they do that? Well, all they'd have to do is go on LinkedIn and see who works in what department, what their name is, maybe even what their email address is, and send them an email. And they will know who their chain of command is. So they'll know who's in the department ahead of them or above them and who to impersonate. And you could say, well, how would they impersonate? Well, they would spoof the email address of that executive, and then do the trickle-down request for a wire transfer to somebody down below. So they are very organized. They're very motivated, and like you said, it is a trend away from the large data breach attacks, where then they have to do a lot more with that data once they get it. This is simply asking you to send us money.
What is a spoof domain, and how does it impact business email compromise?
Right, great question. So a spoof domain is a domain that is made to look extremely similar to a known domain. So, for example, on the slides that we have here, you have on the right side you have a company, and then the threat actor will go ahead and create a domain that looks very similar, changing a couple letters, adding something to it, so that if you look real quick, you're going to recognize, oh, I know that company, I'm expecting that, or I deal with them all the time, and so you will go ahead and assume that that's from the legitimate source. And so for recipients, how to protect yourself, or what a little slowdown is a good technique. Just take a minute, look where it's coming from. Is that what you're used to seeing? And look at that domain and look for any little, so an N, two N's can be an M. You can add an extra S to it. You can add another R. You can see all the different variations there where they're showing deceit that it's not the true company. Now, for investigators, what's helpful to be proactive is when these scams come to light, and if they're reported, and that's what's very important, is reporting them. As they're reporting them, you can identify who's the actual target victim, and it's often that the attack coming at one company, they're going to do it to another company using that same domain. That's an investment on their end to create that domain, and they're going to try and use it as many times as they can. And so they might go through the whole supply chain from that company to try and affect a wire transfer. So on our end, when we're doing the research and we get some of these reported to us, we can look through the threat actor's domain and looking for some indicators of a legitimate company, and then go back and try and find that legitimate company and give them an alert that their name is being used in a business email compromise, so their domain is being spoofed. What they can do in return is they can proactively alert their supply chain or their business relationships and say, we're aware of a particular scheme that's going on, so we want to alert you. If you get an email from us requesting, payment or an invoice, we haven't changed the process that we normally have with you, and please, reach out to us by phone or by normal channels, outside of that email if you suspect, something's fishy.
What is the NCFTA's role in this fight?
Okay, well, we have excellent relationships with many different industry sectors, to include the financial sector. And our relationship with law enforcement helps us get information on potential leads to this business email compromise scheme that we're talking about. And when we identify one domain, we can do some research on that domain and maybe the registrant of that domain, and extrapolate that to try and find other domains that individual may have also created, which will then lead us to future business email attacks. So maybe those that have not happened yet, and we can alert different industry sectors. One successful sector that we've established a good rapport with is the financial sector, and we can alert the financial institutions because they're the fulcrum of where this happens. The money has to be transferred out of a financial institution, and so if we can alert the financial institutions that these businesses appear to have spoof domains out there that either are or will be used in a business email compromise scheme, those financial institutions can take that information and proactively alert their account holders. So for us at the NCFTA, for us to alert 10, 20, or 100 different potential victims, is a bit challenging for us. Whereas if we can go right to the source that has relationships with them, they can, like a bank, the bank can alert the customer a lot easier and a lot quicker than we could. And so over the past several years, as we've been doing this, we've alerted as many as 7,000 accounts, which has saved upwards of $500 million of potential loss. And so that's been extremely helpful, to say the least, to potential victims. And for the financial institutions, they're very appreciative that they're able to provide this intelligence that's being generated here in order to protect their account holders.
There was a recent coordinated sweep by law enforcement on a global basis against business email compromise called WireWire. How is the NCFTA involved in that, and what lessons can we learn?
Right. So as we've talked about, the NCFTA working with private industry on these call them one-offs events that happen. Our goal is to try and make connections to those and show that they aren't disconnected events and that there might be an organized group or individuals behind many or most of them. And if we can do that, we can shed that light to with law enforcement and work with them to try and identify the culprits behind it. When you talk about information sharing, it's helpful to know things, but if we just did two things, identified things that were happening, and then we shared that information, that cycle will never stop. So our goal is to inject law enforcement who has the power and the willingness to conduct disruptive operations against the groups that are doing it without concern over borders and things like that. So the news that you referenced, so just on Monday, June 11th, the Department of Justice made a wide announcement of as many as 74 individuals were arrested in a coordinated law enforcement operation that targeted hundreds of these individuals engaged in business email compromise schemes. Why this is so significant is everyone's familiar with the Nigerian prince scheme, right? So, hey, I'm a Nigerian prince, and you need to send money, so I can send you money, and so many people fall for it. Well, that's fallen off the table. Not so many people do still fall for it, but not as many. But the frustrating part for most people that aren't aware is, well, they're in Nigeria or they're in Europe or they're in some other part of the world, so nobody's going to do anything about it, and we can't identify who it is. And I can tell you that's it couldn't be further from the truth. It might not happen tomorrow or today, but I'm witness to the fact that there are very engaged and aggressive law enforcement agents and agencies who are very willing and able to go after these criminals no matter where they are. And these recent arrests are a great example of that. Call it unprecedented. It is unprecedented that this operation, and it was publicly released, it was called Operation Wire. It was coordinated by the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Treasury, the Secret Service, Homeland Security Investigations, and U.S. Postal Inspection Service. And what they did was, for 6 months prior to this event, they got together and said, let's put together all of our intelligence. So from a U.S. Citizen perspective, you have your major law enforcement agencies actually working together, sharing intelligence for a coordinated effort. And what they did was they created targeting packages around these threat actors, and they used the full force of power of the Department of Justice and the law enforcement agencies, and solicited cooperation from foreign law enforcement, of which they have fantastic relationships. And they got buy-in from these foreign law enforcement agencies, to include Nigeria, which is generally a bit challenging to get. And what they did was they put these targeting packages together, and they sent them to the foreign law enforcement. And some of our law enforcement agents actually traveled overseas to help coordinate these efforts. And they made, again, unprecedented arrests. There were 29 arrests in Nigeria alone, 3 in Canada. There were how many in the U.S.? There were 42 arrested in the United States. So they're getting facilitators in the United States, and they're also getting out to the source of who's initiating these business email compromise messages, and they ultimately reaping the rewards from the stolen money.